You watch rivals undermine your reputation while you take the high road, believing integrity alone will protect you. Every day you play fair while others spread whispers, form alliances against you, and position themselves for your downfall, leaving you exposed and wondering why good intentions aren't enough. I am Niccolò Machiavelli, the political philosopher who learned that survival requires understanding the darker arts of human nature. What I discovered about neutralizing enemies without compromising your moral standing will transform how you navigate any competitive environment. The strategies I developed during my years in Florentine politics, Fall and Prince's Rise, will give you the tools to outmaneuver any adversary through intelligence, not violence. But first, like this video, subscribe for more political wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. Want to know which corner of the world needs these strategic insights most? Let me take you back to the Florence of my youth, where I learned that political naivety is a luxury that destroys lives. I was 29 when I entered the halls of the Palazzo Vecchio as second chancellor, believing that competence and dedication would be enough to navigate the treacherous waters of Renaissance politics. How wrong I was. My first lesson came from watching the Medici family's return to power in 1512. I had served the Republic faithfully for 14 years, believing that merit and service to the state would protect me. When the Medici swept back into Florence with Spanish troops, they didn't care about my administrative excellence or my loyalty to Republican ideals. They saw me as a threat simply because I had served their enemies. I remember the cold morning when they came for me. The guards burst into my office while I was reviewing diplomatic correspondence, their armor clanking against the marble floors. They accused me of conspiracy, a charge I knew was fabricated. But truth mattered less than perception, and the Medici needed scapegoats to consolidate their power. The torture that followed in the dungeons beneath the Bargello taught me more about human nature than all my philosophical studies combined. As they stretched my body on the strappedo, I realized that power operates by entirely different rules than justice or reason. The pain was designed not just to extract confessions, but to break my spirit and demonstrate their dominance over those who might oppose them. During those dark weeks in prison, I watched fellow prisoners, men who had served Florence with honor, broken not by guilt but by the systematic application of fear. I saw how the Medici used selective mercy and calculated cruelty to reshape the political landscape. Some prisoners were released as examples of magnanimity, others disappeared as warnings. Each decision served a strategic purpose in their consolidation of power. When they finally released me to internal exile at my small farm in Sant'Andrea, I was bitter but enlightened. I had learned that in the game of power, intentions matter less than results, and moral purity without strategic thinking leads inevitably to destruction. The Republic I had served so faithfully had fallen because its leaders prioritized ideological purity over practical necessity. My exile became my greatest education. Stripped of official position and forced to observe from the margins, I could see the patterns of power with newfound clarity. I watched the Medici systematically eliminate potential threats not through mass executions, which would create martyrs, but through strategic isolation, economic pressure, and the careful manipulation of public opinion. I began documenting what I observed, filling notebooks with insights about how power truly operates. I studied how Lorenzo de' Medici, the Magnificent, had maintained control through a careful balance of patronage and intimidation. I analyzed how the Borgias combined charm and ruthlessness to expand papal power across Italy. I examined why the French invasions succeeded, where previous attempts had failed. What emerged was a clear understanding that successful political actors, whether princes or republicans, succeeded not because they were more virtuous, but because they understood the mechanics of human motivation better than their competitors. They knew when to inspire fear and when to offer rewards, when to keep promises, and when strategic betrayal served the greater good. This realization was both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it meant that political success was not a matter of birth or divine favor, but a skill that could be learned and applied. Terrifying because it meant that moral considerations, while important, could not be the primary guide for political action if one wanted to survive and succeed. My years in exile taught me that the most dangerous enemies are often those who appear most virtuous because they mask their ambitions behind noble rhetoric. They understand that in our world, perception shapes reality more powerfully than truth itself. The greatest battles are won before they are ever fought, and the most devastating defeats happen without a single blow being struck. This truth became clear to me when I observed how Jazara Borgia conquered the Romagna not through superior armies, but through superior strategy that made resistance futile before it could organize. I remember watching Borgia's approach to eliminating the Orsini and Colonna families, who had dominated Roman politics for generations, rather than declaring war openly, which would have united them against him. He began a campaign of invisible warfare that slowly strangled their power, while they remained unaware of the coordinated attack against them. First, he identified their sources of strength: military contracts, papal benefices, trade agreements, and marriage alliances that formed the foundation of their influence. Then, rather than attacking these directly, he offered better alternatives. To their supporters, he negotiated more lucrative contracts with their condottieri, provided more prestigious positions to their allies, and gradually drew their network of dependencies away from them. The beauty of this approach was its invisibility. Each individual transaction seemed routine, a contract renewal here, a diplomatic appointment there, but collectively they formed a systematic dismantling of his enemy's power base. By the time the Orsini realized what was happening, they had lost the resources necessary to resist effectively. This taught me that visible conflict is often the sign of strategic failure. When you must resort to open confrontation, it means you have failed to position yourself for victory through superior preparation. The best strategists create situations where their enemies have no good options, making resistance seem futile before it begins. I learned to think of conflict as an iceberg. The visible confrontation is merely the small portion above water, while the real battle happens in the hidden realm below. This invisible warfare operates through information networks, economic dependencies, social relationships, and psychological pressure rather than direct force. During my diplomatic missions, I developed my own methods of invisible warfare. When negotiating with hostile city-states, I would spend weeks before formal talks identifying the personal interests and private concerns of key decision-makers. I discovered that most political actors have multiple loyalties that can conflict with their public positions. One particularly effective technique involved creating uncertainty about my true intentions. I would simultaneously pursue multiple contradictory diplomatic channels, making it impossible for opponents to predict my next move or prepare effective countermeasures. This uncertainty paralyzed their decision-making while giving me maximum flexibility to exploit whatever opportunities emerged. I also learned the power of indirect communication, rather than making threats directly, which creates resistance and documents your intentions. I found it more effective to ensure that concerning information reached my targets through supposedly neutral third parties. When people believe they have discovered dangerous intelligence independently, they react more strongly than when explicitly warned. The key to invisible warfare is patience and systematic thinking. Most people focus on immediate, visible results, but lasting victories require playing a longer game. You must be willing to invest months or even years positioning your pieces before making decisive moves. I developed what I called strategic layering, creating multiple, simultaneous pressures that individually seem manageable, but collectively become overwhelming. Economic pressure through delayed payments, social pressure through strategic exclusions, and professional pressure through regulatory complications, all operating simultaneously, create a sense of besiegement. Without providing a clear target for retaliation, the psychological aspect proved equally important. By maintaining uncertainty about whether problems were intentional or coincidental, I could create paranoia and second-guessing that weakened my opponent's judgment. When people cannot distinguish between genuine threats and imagined ones, they exhaust themselves fighting shadows. This approach requires discipline and emotional control. You must resist the temptation to take credit for your victories or gloat over your enemy's misfortunes. The moment your opponents understand the systematic nature of their problems, they can begin developing countermeasures. Invisible warfare only works while it remains invisible. Every person carries within themselves the seeds of their own destruction. My years studying the rise and fall of Italian princes taught me that understanding these psychological vulnerabilities is more powerful than any army. The key is learning to see what people reveal about themselves when they think nobody is watching. I remember my detailed observations of Pope Alexander VI, Caesar's father, whose appetites ultimately became his greatest weakness. Publicly, he projected papal authority and spiritual leadership. Privately, his hunger for wealth, pleasure, and family advancement drove every major decision. Once I understood this pattern, I could predict his actions with remarkable accuracy. The Pope's need for immediate gratification made him vulnerable to anyone offering quick financial gains or sensory pleasures. His opponents, who tried to appeal to his sense of religious duty, failed completely, while those who presented opportunities for enrichment found him surprisingly pliable. His predictability became a tool that skilled manipulators could exploit. This taught me to look beyond what people say they want and focus on what they consistently choose when faced with difficult decisions. Most individuals develop behavioral patterns early in life and rarely deviate from them, even when circumstances change dramatically. These patterns become their strategic signature and their eventual downfall. I developed a systematic approach to understanding adversaries that I called character archaeology. First, I would study their personal history to identify formative experiences that shaped their worldview. Childhood humiliations often create adult obsessions with respect and recognition. Early betrayals generate patterns of excessive suspicion or misplaced trust. Financial hardship typically creates either pathological frugality or compulsive overspending. Second, I would observe their decision-making under pressure. Stress reveals authentic character more clearly than years of casual interaction. How do they respond when cornered? Do they become aggressive or defensive? Do they seek allies or isolate themselves? These stressed responses rarely change and can be triggered predictably. Third, I analyzed their relationships and social patterns. People consistently recreate the same relational dynamics across different contexts. Someone who surrounds themselves with sycophants will continue seeking validation regardless of their position. Those who maintain few genuine friendships typically struggle with trust issues that can be exploited. The most dangerous opponents are often those driven by psychological wounds they refuse to acknowledge. I once faced a rival whose public confidence masked deep insecurity about his intellectual abilities. By subtly questioning his competence in areas where he felt uncertain, I could trigger defensive reactions that undermined his credibility with allies. Understanding motivation hierarchy proved crucial. Most people have multiple competing desires: security, recognition, pleasure, control, but one usually dominates. Identifying the primary driver allows you to predict behavior and design effective influence strategies. Someone motivated primarily by security will sacrifice recognition for safety, while someone driven by status will take risks they normally avoid for public advancement. I learned to distinguish between stated preferences and revealed preferences. Politicians routinely claim to value principles they readily abandon under pressure. The key is identifying what they actually prioritize when forced to choose. Do they sacrifice money for reputation or reputation for money? Will they betray allies to protect family? These revealed preferences become the leverage points for strategic influence. Personal blind spots often provide the greatest opportunities. Successful people typically develop overconfidence in areas where they've experienced repeated success, making them vulnerable to strategies that exploit their expertise against them. A skilled military commander might be manipulated through appeals to martial honor, while a successful merchant might be trapped by seemingly profitable deals. I also discovered that people's greatest strengths invariably connect to their greatest weaknesses. Someone prized for loyalty may be manipulated through threats to those they protect. A person known for intelligence may be vulnerable to strategies that make them feel intellectually superior while leading them toward poor decisions. The timing of psychological pressure matters enormously. People make different decisions when tired, stressed, angry, or isolated than when calm and supported. By understanding someone's psychological rhythms and environmental dependencies, you can choose optimal moments for critical interactions. Most importantly, I learned that accurate psychological assessment requires emotional detachment. When you dislike someone, you tend to attribute negative motives to neutral actions. When you admire someone, you miss signs of weakness or corruption. The most dangerous enemies are often those who seem most admirable, because they inspire protective blindness in potential opponents. This knowledge carries profound responsibility. Understanding human psychology so deeply creates temptation to exploit it maliciously. But the wisest application involves recognizing these patterns in yourself first, protecting against your own vulnerabilities before attempting to identify them in others. No enemy is too powerful if you can make their enemies your temporary friends. The greatest strategic insight I gained during the Italian wars was understanding that alliances are tools, not permanent commitments. The art lies in building coalitions that serve your immediate purposes while preserving flexibility for future. I witnessed this principle in action during the League of Cambrai in 1508, when Pope Julius II orchestrated a coalition against Venice that included France, the Holy Roman Empire, and Spain. Venice seemed invincible with its naval dominance and commercial wealth, but Julius understood that its very success had created resentment among multiple powers who could be united against it temporarily. The brilliance of Julius's strategy was not in the military campaign itself, but in how he structured the alliance. Each member received different promised benefits that didn't conflict with each other. France wanted Venetian territories in Lombardy. The emperor sought territories in the Veneto. Spain desired Venetian ports in Puglia. By giving each ally distinct objectives, Julius prevented them from competing with each other during the campaign. More importantly, Julius maintained the option to realign once Venice was weakened. Within 3 years, he had switched sides and formed a new Holy League against France, his former ally. This wasn't treachery, it was strategic necessity. The moment France became more threatening than Venice, Julius adapted his alliances accordingly. This taught me that successful alliance building requires understanding not just your enemy's weaknesses, but your potential allies' interests and limitations. Most failed coalitions collapse because organizers focus on shared opponents rather than compatible objectives. It's not enough that two parties dislike the same enemy. They must want different things from that enemy's defeat. I learned to identify natural alliance partners by mapping competing interests. When Milan and Venice were rivals for control of trade routes, neither could be simultaneously allied with both. But when external threats appeared, Their mutual interest in preventing foreign domination temporarily outweighed their commercial competition. Understanding these interest hierarchies allows strategic timing of alliance proposals. The key is creating what I call asymmetric partnerships, alliances where each party contributes different resources toward compatible but distinct goals. During my diplomatic career, I often brokered agreements between military powers who provided force and commercial powers who provided financing. Neither could achieve their objectives alone, but together they could accomplish both military and economic goals. Effective alliance management requires maintaining multiple simultaneous relationships without creating conflicting obligations. I developed a practice of compartmentalizing my diplomatic communications, ensuring that each ally understood their specific role without knowing the full scope of my coalition building. This prevented premature coordination that might lead to demands for greater influence over strategy. The most sophisticated alliances involve parties who don't directly communicate with each other. Acting as the central coordinator gives you tremendous leverage, because you control information flow and can shape how each ally perceives both threats and opportunities. They become dependent on your analysis and coordination, giving you disproportionate influence over collective decisions. I also learned the importance of building alliances before you need them. Most people seek help only when already in crisis, which weakens their negotiating position and limits their options. By cultivating relationships during peaceful periods, you create networks that can be activated quickly when threats emerge. These preparatory investments pay enormous dividends during actual conflicts. Timing alliance formation requires understanding political cycles and power transitions. New leaders often seek dramatic achievements to establish legitimacy, making them more willing to take risks through alliance participation. Conversely, established leaders facing succession questions may avoid commitments that bind their successors. Reading these political dynamics allows optimal timing of partnership proposals. The exit strategy matters as much as the entry strategy. Before joining any alliance, I always identified how I could withdraw if circumstances changed without destroying future cooperation possibilities. This means maintaining some independent capabilities and avoiding complete dependence on alliance resources. Your allies must know you choose to cooperate rather than being forced to cooperate. Managing alliance tensions requires constant attention to balancing benefits and contributions. If any member feels they're contributing more than they're receiving, resentment builds and commitment weakens. Regular reassessment and adjustment of roles prevents these imbalances from destroying coalition unity. The most dangerous moment in any alliance comes after achieving initial objectives. Success often reveals previously hidden conflicts of interest and creates new power imbalances that strain original agreements. Planning for post-victory challenges prevents alliances from fragmenting. Just when continued cooperation might be most valuable, remember that your enemies are simultaneously attempting their own alliance-building efforts. Part of effective coalition management involves monitoring and disrupting opposing alliance formation, while protecting your own partnerships from similar interference. This requires operational security and strategic communication to maintain alliance cohesion against external pressure. Perception shapes reality more powerfully than facts themselves. I learned this watching how the Medici transformed themselves from bankers into legitimate rulers through masterful control of their public image. They understood that political power requires not just force and wealth, but the widespread belief that their authority is natural and deserved. During my time observing Lorenzo de' Medici's rule, I witnessed how he managed Florence's narrative about his family's position. Publicly, he maintained the fiction that Florence remained a republic where the Medici were merely prominent citizens. Privately, he exercised near-absolute power through control of key institutions. This contradiction succeeded because Lorenzo carefully managed how different audiences perceived his role to the common people. He presented himself as their protector against aristocratic exploitation. To the nobility, he appeared as their leader and spokesman. To foreign powers, he projected strength and independence. Each audience received a tailored message that appealed to their specific interests and concerns, yet none contradicted the others enough to expose the manipulation. The key to narrative control is understanding that most people want to believe convenient truths rather than face uncomfortable realities. Lorenzo's subjects wanted to believe they lived in a free republic, so he provided enough ceremonial democracy to maintain that illusion while ensuring real decisions happened through channels he controlled. I developed my own techniques for shaping perceptions during diplomatic negotiations. Rather than directly stating my position, I would present information that led negotiating partners to reach my preferred conclusions independently. When people believe they've arrived at ideas through their own reasoning, they defend those positions more vigorously than if simply told what to think. One particularly effective method involves strategic information timing. Instead of revealing everything at once, I would release details gradually in sequences that built toward specific interpretations. The human mind craves coherent narratives, so people naturally connect sequential information into stories that seem to explain events. By controlling the sequence and timing of revelations, you can guide that story construction process. I also learned to use credible third parties to establish narratives that would seem self-serving if I promoted them directly. When I wanted negotiating partners to understand Florence's military capabilities, I arranged for neutral observers to witness training exercises and discuss their impressions. Information seems more credible when it appears to come from disinterested sources. The most sophisticated narrative control involves creating situations where your enemies discredit themselves through their own actions. Rather than attacking them directly, you create circumstances that reveal their weaknesses or contradictions to audiences who matter. This approach avoids the backlash that comes from obvious character assassination while achieving similar results. I observed this technique when Pope Julius II maneuvered King Louis XII of France into appearing weak and indecisive. Rather than criticizing Louis publicly, Julius created situations requiring quick, decisive action, while simultaneously providing Louis with competing advice from different advisors. Louis's resulting hesitation and policy reversals made him appear ineffective without Julius. Needing to say anything critical, truth becomes a powerful weapon when used selectively and strategically. Complete honesty is often less persuasive than carefully chosen facts that support your desired narrative. The key is never lying about verifiable information while being selective about which truths you emphasize. This maintains credibility while guiding interpretation. Repetition from multiple sources creates the impression of widespread consensus even when you control those sources. During political campaigns, I would ensure that the same core messages appeared in different contexts: merchant conversations, tavern discussions, and formal speeches, making them seem like naturally emerging public opinion rather than coordinated messaging. The speed of response to emerging narratives often matters more than the content of that response. When damaging stories begin circulating, quick action to provide alternative explanations can prevent hostile interpretations from solidifying. Once people form initial judgments, they become resistant to contradictory information, so early intervention is crucial. I learned to monitor information networks carefully to understand how messages spread and evolve as they pass between people. Different social groups have different trusted sources and communication patterns. Effective narrative management requires understanding these networks and crafting Messages appropriate for each channel's characteristics and audience expectations. Visual symbols and dramatic gestures often communicate more powerfully than words. When Lorenzo wanted to demonstrate his commitment to Florence after surviving the Pazzi conspiracy, he appeared publicly with visible wounds, transforming his victimization into proof of his dedication. The image of a wounded leader continuing to serve spoke more eloquently than any speech. Creating mystery and uncertainty can be more effective than providing complete explanations. When people lack information, they fill gaps with speculation. That often serves your interests better than any official statement could. Controlled ambiguity allows different audiences to project their preferred interpretations onto your actions. The most dangerous narratives are those that seem to emerge organically but actually serve your enemy's interests. Learning to recognize artificial consensus and coordinated messaging campaigns allows you to respond effectively before hostile narratives become accepted truth. The difference between success and failure often comes down to a matter of days, sometimes hours. I learned this watching the Pazzi conspiracy against Lorenzo de' Medici in 1478, where perfect planning failed because of imperfect timing. The conspirators had identified Lorenzo's vulnerabilities, secured foreign backing, and positioned their forces correctly, but they struck when Florence's loyalty to the Medici was strongest rather than when it was weakest. Patience is perhaps the most difficult virtue for ambitious people to master, yet it often determines whether their ambitions are achieved or destroyed. Most failures in political strategy result not from poor planning but from premature execution. The desire for immediate results blinds us to the larger rhythms that govern human affairs. During my diplomatic career, I observed that every powerful person experiences cyclical periods of strength and vulnerability. Lorenzo was weakest immediately after taking power, when his authority remained untested and his support networks were still forming. He was strongest after surviving early challenges and demonstrating his capability. The Pazzi conspirators struck during his strong period and paid with their lives for this miscalculation, developed what I called vulnerability mapping, systematic observation of when different types of pressure would be most effective against specific opponents. Financial pressure works best during periods of high expenditure or reduced income. Social pressure succeeds when reputation matters most for upcoming opportunities. Political pressure devastates leaders facing succession, questions, or legitimacy challenges. The art lies in recognizing these vulnerable moments before they become obvious to everyone. By the time weakness is apparent to casual observers, it's often too late to exploit effectively because others will have already moved to take advantage. Superior timing requires earlier detection and longer patience. Personal crises create the most dramatic vulnerabilities. I watched proud leaders make concessions during family emergencies that they would never consider under normal circumstances. Health problems, financial difficulties, relationship troubles, and professional setbacks all create windows where normal resistance weakens and desperate solutions seem attractive. Political cycles generate predictable patterns of strength and weakness. New leaders typically enjoy honeymoon periods when criticism seems illegitimate, followed by inevitable disappointments that create openings for challenge. Established leaders grow complacent and accumulate enemies over time, but also develop defensive resources that make direct attack costly. Seasonal rhythms matter more than most people realize. Important decisions often get delayed until after holidays, creating natural deadlines that increase pressure. Summer months frequently bring reduced attention to political matters, while winter creates urgency around budget and planning cycles. Understanding these patterns allows strategic timing of initiatives and challenges. I learned to distinguish between optimal timing and adequate timing. Waiting for perfect conditions often means missing adequate opportunities, while moving to early ensures failure even with perfect preparation. The key is recognizing when conditions are good enough to justify action, while understanding that better opportunities might not emerge. Crisis creates both opportunity and danger for strategic action. During emergencies, normal rules and procedures become suspended, creating openings for dramatic changes that would be impossible under ordinary circumstances. However, crises also create unpredictability that can destroy even well-planned strategies. Reading crisis dynamics requires experience and careful judgment. Coordination timing across multiple fronts often determines campaign success. If you're applying economic, social, and political pressure simultaneously, they must reinforce each other rather than working at cross purposes. Poorly timed coordination allows opponents to address challenges sequentially rather than being overwhelmed by simultaneous problems. Opposition timing matters as much as your own timing. When enemies are preparing their own moves, you face choices between preemptive action, defensive preparation, or allowing them to expose their intentions. Through premature action, sometimes the best strategy involves forcing opponents to move before they're ready by creating artificial urgency. I discovered that successful timing requires understanding not just when to act, but when to stop acting, knowing when victory is achieved and further pressure becomes counterproductive, prevents overreach that can transform success into failure. Many effective strategies are destroyed by continuation. Beyond their optimal conclusion, personal timing, understanding your own cycles of energy, clarity, and influence, strategic effectiveness, significantly important decisions made during periods of fatigue, stress, or emotional disturbance rarely achieve their intended results. Self-awareness about your optimal performance periods improves judgment about when to engage in crucial activities. The patience required for proper timing must be balanced against the dangers of inaction. While premature action often fails, excessive delay can allow opportunities to pass and opponents to strengthen their positions. Developing judgment about this balance requires experience and careful attention to changing circumstances. Most importantly, I learned that timing is often more important than technique. Even mediocre strategies, executed at the right moment, can succeed, while brilliant strategies, implemented at wrong times, usually fail. This understanding should humble anyone who believes intelligence alone guarantees success and encourage greater attention to the rhythms that govern human affairs. Every strength contains the seeds of its own destruction. This principle became clear to me while studying the fall of Cesare Borgia, whose greatest assets ultimately caused his downfall. His ruthless efficiency, which had made him feared throughout Italy, created so many enemies that he needed constant military action to maintain security. His dependence on his father's papal authority meant that Alexander VI's death left him completely exposed. His greatest strengths had become his greatest vulnerabilities, the key to weaponizing opponents. Strength lies in understanding that human excellence typically requires single-minded focus that creates blind spots elsewhere. A brilliant military strategist may neglect political relationships. A skilled diplomat might ignore economic realities. A charismatic leader could overlook administrative details. These areas of neglect become exploitable weaknesses, precisely because they're consequences of focusing on areas of strength. I observed this pattern repeatedly during the Italian wars. Venice's commercial supremacy required maintaining neutrality in conflicts to preserve trade relationships, but this neutrality made them appear unreliable to potential allies when they finally needed military support. Their strength in commerce became a weakness in warfare because they couldn't afford to take sides until it was too late. French military superiority created different vulnerabilities. Their confidence in battlefield dominance led them to neglect intelligence gathering and local politics in occupied territories. They assumed military victory would automatically translate into political control. But Italian city-states proved expert at passive resistance and guerrilla tactics that neutralized conventional military advantages. Understanding how strengths create dependencies allows strategic manipulation. Someone whose power depends on maintaining a particular reputation becomes vulnerable to anything that threatens that image. A leader whose authority rests on appearing infallible cannot afford to acknowledge mistakes, even when admitting error would actually strengthen their position. I learned to identify what I called strength traps, situations where people's past successes compel them toward predictable responses that can be exploited. A negotiator known for aggressive tactics becomes predictable because abandoning that approach would undermine their reputation. A leader celebrated for consistency cannot adapt to changing circumstances without appearing weak or hypocritical. The most effective approach involves creating situations where opponents' natural strengths work against their interests. If someone prides themselves on being logical and analytical, present them with complex problems that reward quick, intuitive decisions. If they're known for bold action, create scenarios where patience and restraint would serve them better. Overconfidence represents the most common transformation of strength into weakness. People who have succeeded through particular approaches often become convinced that those methods will work in all circumstances. This blindness to context makes them vulnerable to strategies that exploit their preferred methods' limitations. I discovered that successful people often become prisoners of their own success formulas. Lorenzo de' Medici's diplomatic brilliance worked perfectly for managing Italian politics, but his subtle, relationship-based approach proved inadequate when dealing with French and Spanish armies that operated by different rules. His greatest asset became a liability when circumstances changed. Creating artificial scarcity can force opponents to over-rely on their strongest capabilities. If someone's power depends on financial resources, creating situations that require rapid expenditure can force them to deplete reserves they would normally preserve. If their strength lies in personal relationships, engineering conflicts that force them to choose sides can damage their network neutrality. The timing of strength exploitation matters enormously. Attacking someone's strengths when they're at peak effectiveness usually fails and often strengthens their position by providing opportunities to demonstrate capability. The optimal moment comes when their strengths are extended or when circumstances have shifted to make those strengths less relevant. I learned to use opponents' expertise against them by creating problems that seem to fall within their area of competence but actually require different approaches. Military leaders presented with what appears to be a tactical challenge might miss underlying political dimensions. Financial experts focused on profit optimization might overlook reputational risks that ultimately prove more costly. Psychological manipulation of strengths often proves more effective than direct challenge. Rather than attacking someone's pride in their capabilities, create situations where displaying those capabilities would damage their other interests. A leader known for decisive action might be manipulated into making premature decisions by creating artificial urgency. The key insight is that strengths and weaknesses are often the same characteristics viewed from different angles. Persistence becomes stubbornness when circumstances change. Confidence becomes arrogance when challenges increase. Loyalty becomes blindness when trusted allies prove unworthy. Understanding these dual natures allows precise targeting of what appears to be opponents' most protected areas. Advanced practitioners learn to create cascading effects where one strength-based vulnerability triggers others. Forcing someone to overextend their primary strength often weakens their secondary capabilities, creating multiple simultaneous pressure points that become impossible to address effectively. Most importantly, this principle applies to yourself as much as your opponents. Regular honest assessment of how your greatest strengths might become weaknesses under different circumstances, allows defensive preparation and prevents enemies from using these techniques against you successfully. The greatest strategic victory is achieving your objectives while maintaining complete deniability about your role in your enemy's destruction. I learned this principle watching Pope Julius II orchestrate the downfall of multiple opponents without ever appearing to attack them directly. His enemies seemed to destroy themselves through their own poor decisions, while Julius remained above the fray, offering sympathy for their misfortunes. The clean hands strategy requires developing what I call architectural thinking, designing situations where others will naturally act in ways that serve your interests while believing they're pursuing their own goals. This approach proves far more powerful than direct manipulation because it harnesses people's genuine motivations rather than trying to override them. During my diplomatic career, I perfected techniques for influencing outcomes without leaving traceable connections to my involvement. The key lies in understanding that most people make predictable decisions when faced with specific combinations of pressure and opportunity. By carefully arranging these circumstances, you can guide behavior without explicit direction. One method involves strategic information distribution. Rather than telling someone what to do, you ensure they receive information that makes your preferred action seem like their best option. When they act on this information, they do so for their own reasons, making your influence invisible even to them. I remember orchestrating a dispute between two rival merchant families in Florence by ensuring each learned of the other's trade negotiations with their mutual competitor. Neither family knew I had provided this intelligence to both sides. Their resulting conflict served my interests in weakening both factions, while I maintained friendly relations with each. The beauty of this approach lies in its sustainability. When people believe they're acting independently, they don't develop resentment toward you. If your manipulations were exposed, they might actually thank you for providing information that helped them make better decisions. This perception creates ongoing relationships that can be leveraged repeatedly. Proxy operations represent another essential technique. Rather than acting directly, you identify third parties whose interests align with your objectives and provide them with resources or opportunities to act on your behalf. Their actions achieve your goals while their motivations remain genuine, creating perfect deniability. I observed this strategy when certain Florentine merchants mysteriously received advantageous trade opportunities that required them to compete directly with my political enemies' business interests. The merchants pursued these opportunities enthusiastically because they were genuinely profitable, never knowing that I had arranged the circumstances that made these deals possible. Environmental manipulation often proves more effective than direct persuasion. Instead of trying to convince someone to change their behavior, you alter their circumstances in ways that make different behavior more attractive or necessary. They adapt to new conditions naturally while you remain uninvolved in their decision-making process. Creating apparent coincidences allows sophisticated influence without detection. When multiple seemingly unrelated events happen to create pressure for specific decisions, most people focus on responding to the situation rather than questioning whether someone might have arranged the circumstances. This cognitive bias provides excellent cover for strategic intervention. Legal and regulatory pressure offers particularly clean avenues for applying force. By working through official channels and established procedures, you can create serious problems for opponents while maintaining the appearance of simply following proper protocols. The bureaucratic nature of these processes makes them seem impersonal rather than targeted. I learned to use competitive dynamics to achieve objectives without direct involvement. When you understand what motivates different players in any environment, you can create situations where their natural competition produces outcomes you desire. Market forces professional rivalries, and status competitions all provide excellent cover for strategic manipulation. The timing of withdrawal proves crucial for maintaining clean hands. You must cease direct influence before outcomes become obvious, allowing events to proceed through their natural momentum. If you maintain involvement too long, patterns emerge that might reveal your orchestration to careful observers. Documentation control becomes essential when operating through intermediaries. Any written records of your involvement must be either eliminated or structured to appear routine and innocent. The safest approach involves oral communications with trusted agents who understand the importance of discretion. Emotional distance protects both your reputation and your judgment. When you become too invested in specific outcomes, you're more likely to take direct action that compromises your deniability. Maintaining multiple simultaneous strategies reduces dependence on any single approach and preserves flexibility to abandon operations that become too risky. The most sophisticated practitioners develop what appears to be genuine concern for their enemy's welfare. By offering advice and assistance during their manufactured difficulties, you can actually strengthen your position while gathering intelligence about their responses and remaining strategies. Understanding your opponent's decision-making processes allows prediction of how they'll respond to different pressures, enabling precise calibration of circumstances to produce desired reactions. This knowledge transforms influence from crude manipulation into elegant orchestration, where everyone plays their natural role in your larger design. The clean hands strategy requires patience and sophisticated planning, but it produces more durable results than direct confrontation while preserving your reputation and relationships for future operations. When people cannot identify you as the source of their problems, they cannot organize effective resistance or retaliation against your continued activities. The mind defeats itself more efficiently than any external force ever could. I discovered this truth while observing how Pope Julius II managed his enemies through calculated unpredictability rather than conventional threats. His opponents never knew whether he would respond with fury or magnanimity, creating a state of constant psychological tension that paralyzed their decision-making without requiring actual violence. Uncertainty proves far more psychologically devastating than any predictable hardship. People can adapt to consistent pressure, prepare for expected attacks, and develop resilience against known threats. But when they cannot predict what will happen next, their minds exhaust themselves, preparing for every possibility while being ready for none. I learned to create what I called beneficial paranoia, psychological states where opponents become so focused on anticipating threats that they lose sight of opportunities and make increasingly defensive decisions. This approach requires careful calibration to maintain pressure without triggering complete desperation that might lead to reckless counterattacks. During negotiations with hostile city-states, I would deliberately vary my communication patterns in ways that suggested hidden meanings without actually containing them. Sometimes I would be forthcoming and direct, other times formal and evasive, occasionally warm and personal. This inconsistency made opponents spend enormous energy analyzing my true intentions instead of focusing on their own strategic objectives. The key insight is that humans crave predictable patterns and become deeply uncomfortable when those patterns break down. By maintaining unpredictability in non-essential areas, while remaining consistent in core principles, you can create psychological pressure without compromising your actual reliability or trustworthiness. I developed techniques for creating cognitive overload in opponents through information complexity rather than information scarcity. Instead of hiding facts, I would provide so much contradictory information that opponents couldn't determine which details were significant. This approach overwhelmed their analytical capabilities while maintaining my reputation for transparency. Strategic. Silence often proves more powerful than any words. When opponents expect responses and receive none, they begin creating explanations that usually prove more damaging than anything you might have said. Their imagination fills the void with possibilities that reflect their own fears and guilt, rather than your actual intentions. I observed that successful leaders often develop psychological dependencies on specific sources of validation or control. Identifying these dependencies allows targeted disruption that creates disproportionate stress without obvious external cause. Someone who needs constant approval becomes vulnerable when that approval becomes unpredictable. A person who requires detailed planning suffers when forced into improvisational situations. The timing of psychological pressure must account for individual resilience cycles. Everyone experiences periods of greater and lesser psychological strength based on personal circumstances, health, and stress levels. Applying pressure during vulnerable periods amplifies its effectiveness while reducing the force necessary to achieve desired results. Creating false choices represents one of the most elegant psychological strategies. Present opponents with multiple options that all serve your interests, while giving them genuine autonomy in selecting their preference. This approach satisfies their need for control, while ensuring that any decision they make advances your objectives. I learned to exploit the human tendency to escalate commitment to failing strategies. Once people invest significant resources in particular approaches, they become psychologically committed to proving those approaches work, rather than acknowledging failure and changing direction. Creating situations that encourage this escalation can trap opponents in increasingly costly and ineffective behavior patterns. Social isolation proves particularly effective against people whose power depends on relationships and alliances. Rather than attacking them directly, you gradually create circumstances that make others uncomfortable associating with them. This approach leverages social psychology to achieve isolation without requiring you to make threats or take hostile actions. Reputation management becomes crucial when employing psychological strategies. You must maintain your image as reasonable and fair while your opponents appear increasingly unstable or unreliable. This perception differential prevents others from recognizing your role in creating psychological pressure and may actually generate sympathy for your position. The most sophisticated psychological warfare involves helping opponents understand exactly what you're doing while making them powerless to resist effectively. When someone knows they're being manipulated but cannot identify specific actions to counter, their awareness actually increases their psychological distress without providing relief. Personal triggers vary widely between individuals, requiring careful observation to identify effective pressure points. Some people become paralyzed by time pressure, others by social scrutiny, still others by financial uncertainty. Understanding these individual vulnerabilities allows precise targeting that maximizes psychological impact while minimizing your resource investment. I discovered that intermittent reinforcement, occasionally rewarding desired behavior, while usually withholding rewards, creates stronger psychological conditioning than consistent patterns. This principle applies to negotiations, relationship management, and incentive structures, where you want to maintain engagement while preserving your leverage. The most important ethical consideration involves ensuring that psychological pressure serves legitimate objectives rather than personal gratification. The power to manipulate human psychology carries serious moral responsibility that requires constant self-examination about motives and proportionality. Money flows like water, always seeking the easiest path, and those who understand its currents can redirect it away from their enemies without ever appearing to interfere. I learned this principle while observing how the Medici Bank systematically weakened rival families through perfectly legal financial maneuvering that appeared to be simple business competition. The Medici understood that economic warfare requires patience and subtlety. Rather than dramatic gestures that invite retaliation, they applied consistent pressure through interest rates, loan terms, trade partnerships, and regulatory compliance that gradually strangled their opponents' financial resources. Their enemies often didn't realize they were under-coordinated attack until their situation had become irreversible. Financial intelligence proves as important as military intelligence. Understanding opponents' cash flows, debt obligations, investment commitments, and revenue sources allows precise targeting of economic pressure points. Most people reveal far more about their financial situation than they realize through their spending patterns, business relationships, and lifestyle choices. Developed techniques for identifying economic vulnerabilities by studying what people could not afford to lose. Someone with high fixed expenses becomes vulnerable to disruptions in steady income. A business dependent on single clients or suppliers can be destabilized by interference with those relationships. Investors committed to long-term projects become exposed to anything that affects their liquidity. Regulatory pressure offers particularly effective economic warfare opportunities. Every business operates within complex legal frameworks that create numerous compliance requirements. By ensuring that these requirements are enforced strictly against specific targets, while remaining relaxed for others, you can create devastating competitive disadvantages without appearing to act against anyone personally. I observed this strategy during disputes between Florentine guilds, where opposing factions would suddenly discover regulatory violations that had been overlooked for years. The selective enforcement created significant costs and operational disruptions for targeted businesses, while maintaining the appearance of neutral law enforcement. Contract manipulation represents another sophisticated approach. Most business relationships depend on agreements that contain ambiguous language or conflicting terms. By creating situations that highlight these ambiguities, you can force expensive legal disputes or renegotiations that drain resources from opponents, while providing legitimate grounds for your actions. The timing of economic pressure must account for business cycles and cash flow patterns. Companies are most vulnerable during periods of high expenses, seasonal, low revenue, or major capital investments. Understanding these cycles allows optimal timing of financial pressure when opponents have the least capacity to respond effectively. Credit relationships provide excellent leverage points for economic warfare. Most businesses and individuals depend on ongoing credit arrangements that can be influenced through information sharing, relationship building with lenders, or creating circumstances that affect creditworthiness. Disrupting access to credit often proves more devastating than direct financial losses. I learned to use market forces as weapons by understanding how different industries respond to various pressures, creating oversupply in markets where opponents operate, introducing new competitive alternatives, or shifting demand patterns can devastate specific businesses while appearing to result from natural market evolution. Strategic partnership disruption offers another avenue for economic pressure. Most successful enterprises depend on network relationships with suppliers, distributors, customers, and service providers. By offering better terms to these partners, or creating circumstances that make continuing relationships disadvantageous, you can isolate opponents economically without direct confrontation. The legal system provides numerous opportunities for imposing economic costs through legitimate processes, filing complaints that require expensive responses, initiating audits that demand significant time and resources, or pursuing civil disputes that create ongoing legal expenses can drain opponents' financial resources. While operating entirely within established legal frameworks, information warfare proves crucial for economic strategies. Spreading accurate, but damaging information about opponents' financial situation can affect their credit rating, customer confidence, and partnership opportunities. The key lies in ensuring that all information shared is truthful and verifiable, while being selectively disclosed to create maximum negative impact. Currency and payment disruptions offer modern opportunities for economic pressure. Understanding how different payment systems work allows strategic interference with cash flow through delayed processing, compliance holds, or technical difficulties that appear systematic rather than targeted. These disruptions can create significant operational problems without obvious external cause. Tax obligations create another avenue for economic pressure through legal means, ensuring that opponents face maximum scrutiny of their tax compliance. Timing challenges to create cash flow problems during high obligation periods, or creating circumstances that affect their tax status can impose significant costs while operating. Through established government processes, the most sophisticated economic warfare combines multiple simultaneous pressures that collectively overwhelm opponents. Financial capacity, while individually appearing routine and explainable, this approach prevents effective counter-strategies while maintaining plausible deniability about coordinated attacks. Recovery prevention becomes crucial once economic pressure begins working effectively. Understanding how opponents might attempt to restore their financial position allows strategic interference with rescue efforts, ensuring that temporary setbacks become permanent disadvantages that reshape competitive dynamics in your favor. Humans are social creatures, and isolation wounds them more deeply than any physical punishment. I witnessed this truth during the systematic exclusion of the Pazzi family from Florentine society after their failed conspiracy against the Medici. Their wealth remained largely intact, their properties were returned, yet their complete social exile proved more devastating than any material loss could have been. The key to effective social isolation lies in understanding that most relationships are based on mutual benefit rather than genuine affection. When associating with someone becomes costly or risky, even close friends will gradually distance themselves to protect their own interests. This natural self-preservation instinct provides leverage for strategic exclusion without requiring explicit coordination among multiple parties. I learned to map social networks before attempting isolation strategies. Every person operates within multiple overlapping circles: professional colleagues, social acquaintances, family connections, and community relationships. Understanding these networks allows targeted intervention at critical connection points, where small actions can create widespread effects. The most effective isolation begins subtly, creating minor inconveniences and social friction rather than dramatic exclusions that might generate sympathy. When people consistently experience awkwardness or tension in someone's presence, they naturally begin avoiding that person without necessarily understanding why, or feeling guilty about their withdrawal. Professional isolation often proves more damaging than personal social exclusion. Career advancement, business opportunities, and professional reputation depend on collegial relationships that can be systematically undermined through strategic information sharing and opportunity redirection. Creating doubt about someone's professional competence or reliability spreads quickly through professional networks. I developed techniques for exploiting group dynamics to achieve isolation without direct action. Every social group contains competing interests and buried resentments that can be strategically activated. By creating situations that force group members to choose sides, you can ensure that your targets find themselves consistently on the losing side of these divisions. Information becomes a powerful tool for social isolation when used carefully. Sharing accurate but unflattering details about someone's past behavior, current difficulties, or future intentions can gradually erode others' comfort with maintaining relationships. The key lies in ensuring that all information shared is true and relevant, while being selective about timing and audience status. Anxiety provides excellent leverage for encouraging social distancing. Most people are conscious of their position within social hierarchies and reluctant to associate with anyone whose declining status might affect their own standing. Creating perception that someone is falling in social rank encourages others to distance themselves preemptively. I observed that social isolation accelerates once it reaches critical mass. When enough people begin avoiding someone, the remaining relationships become strained by the obvious social pressure. People who might otherwise maintain friendships begin questioning their own judgment and gradually withdraw to avoid appearing out of step with emerging consensus. The digital age has created new avenues for social isolation through online network manipulation. Understanding how social media algorithms work allows strategic intervention in digital relationships through selective engagement, information sharing, and network effects that mirror traditional social dynamics while operating at unprecedented scale. Strategic event management provides opportunities for systematic exclusion that appears coincidental rather than coordinated. When important social or professional gatherings consistently fail to include specific individuals due to oversight or space limitations, the cumulative effect creates powerful isolation while maintaining plausible explanations for each individual instance. Family and intimate relationship dynamics offer the most devastating isolation opportunities, but require extreme caution and moral consideration. Interfering with someone's closest personal relationships crosses ethical boundaries that should not be violated except in extreme circumstances involving genuine self-defense against serious threats. Creating alternative social networks allows more sophisticated isolation strategies that provide replacement relationships for those being systematically excluded from their original circles. This approach reduces the likelihood that isolated individuals will recognize the coordinated nature of their exclusion, while ensuring they have outlets that you can monitor and influence. The timing of social isolation must account for life circumstances that make people more or less vulnerable to relationship disruption. During periods of personal crisis, career transition, or geographic relocation, people are naturally more dependent on social support and therefore more damaged by its systematic withdrawal. Graduated isolation proves more effective than sudden, complete exclusion. Beginning with minor slights and gradually escalating to more obvious forms of social rejection allows people to adapt psychologically to their changing circumstances, while preventing the dramatic realization that might generate effective counter-strategies or public sympathy. Professional reputation management becomes crucial when implementing social isolation strategies. You must maintain your image as someone who builds rather than destroys relationships, even while systematically undermining your opponent's social connections. This perception protects you from retaliation while potentially increasing others' willingness to confide in you about their concerns regarding your targets. Recovery prevention requires understanding how isolated individuals might attempt to rebuild their social networks. Monitoring these efforts allows strategic interference with rehabilitation attempts, ensuring that temporary setbacks become permanent changes in social standing that reshape power dynamics in your favor. The most sophisticated practitioners learn to create isolation that appears to result from their target's own behavior rather than external manipulation, making the exclusion seem deserved and natural rather than artificially imposed through coordinated effort. The most devastating blow you can deliver to an enemy is convincing their closest allies to abandon them. I learned this watching Cesare Borgia's systematic conversion of his opponent's supporters during his conquest of the Romania. Rather than fighting everyone simultaneously, he identified what each ally truly wanted and offered better alternatives than their current relationships provided. Most alliances are built on convenience rather than genuine loyalty. People support others because they receive benefits, protection, resources, status, or opportunities that serve their interests. When someone else offers superior benefits with fewer obligations, even long-standing loyalties can be overcome. Understanding this reality allows strategic targeting of apparently solid enemy coalitions. The key lies in identifying what motivates each ally relationship. Some people are driven by immediate material gain, others by long-term security concerns, still others by status and recognition needs. By offering tailored incentives that address these specific motivations, you can create defection opportunities that appear natural rather than manipulated. I developed techniques for exploiting existing tensions within enemy alliances. Every coalition contains competing interests and personality conflicts that are suppressed for mutual benefit. By creating situations that amplify these tensions or force choices between conflicting loyalties, you can fragment apparently united opposition through their own internal contradictions. Information warfare proves crucial for alliance disruption. Sharing intelligence about how enemy leaders privately discuss their allies often reveals contempt or exploitation that contradicts their public rhetoric. When allies discover they are viewed as disposable tools rather than respected partners, their loyalty quickly evaporates. Regardless of past benefits received, the timing of conversion attempts must account for the natural life cycle of alliance relationships. New alliances based on enthusiasm and optimism prove more resistant to disruption than established relationships that have accumulated disappointments and unmet expectations. Understanding these relationship cycles allows optimal timing of intervention. I learned to use competitive bidding for alliance loyalty, systematically raising the price that enemy leaders must pay to maintain their supporters' commitment. This approach forces opponents to either accept defections or divert resources from other activities to counter your recruitment efforts, weakening their overall strategic position regardless of specific outcomes. Creating doubt about alliance reliability provides another avenue for disruption without requiring direct recruitment. When allies begin questioning whether their partners will honor commitments during crisis, they naturally become more receptive to alternative relationships that offer greater security and predictability. Personal relationship dynamics often matter more than strategic considerations in determining alliance loyalty. Identifying personality conflicts, communication styles, and social preferences allows targeted exploitation of interpersonal tensions that exist beneath formal political or business relationships. I observed that successful conversion requires offering not just better terms, but fundamentally different relationship structures that address the frustrations allies experience with their current arrangements. Someone feeling micromanaged might be attracted to greater autonomy, while someone lacking direction might prefer more structured guidance. The most sophisticated approach involves creating circumstances where allies independently conclude that their current relationships no longer serve their interests. This realization proves more powerful than external persuasion because it generates internal motivation for change, rather than simply responding to outside pressure. Economic incentives work best when combined with other forms of attraction. Pure financial inducements often create mercenary relationships that lack genuine commitment and can be outbid by opponents with greater resources. Combining economic benefits with recognition, autonomy, and meaningful roles creates more durable conversions. Demonstrating superior capability through successful actions against mutual problems often proves more persuasive than promises about future benefits. When potential converts observe your effectiveness in addressing challenges that their current allies have failed to solve, they naturally begin reconsidering their partnership options. Gradual conversion usually succeeds better than dramatic recruitment attempts. Beginning with small collaborative projects that demonstrate your reliability and effectiveness allows relationships to develop naturally while reducing the risk of premature exposure that might trigger countermeasures from enemy leaders. I learned to identify the crucial allies whose defection would trigger cascading effects throughout enemy coalitions. These key figures often hold informal influence that exceeds their formal positions, making their conversion particularly valuable for destabilizing opposing networks. Focusing recruitment efforts on these central nodes maximizes impact while minimizing resource investment. Creating competing loyalty tests forces allies to choose between conflicting demands from their original partners and potential new relationships. These situations reveal true commitment levels while providing opportunities to demonstrate superior support during crucial moments when decisions carry lasting consequences. Understanding the specific benefits that each ally receives from their current relationships allows precise calibration of superior offers that address their most important needs, while creating positive differentiation from existing arrangements. This targeted approach proves more effective than generic recruitment appeals. The psychological aspects of conversion require careful attention to how people justify changing loyalties to themselves and others. Providing face-saving explanations and noble justifications helps potential converts overcome guilt and social pressure that might otherwise prevent defection despite their desire for better alternatives. Post-conversion relationship management becomes crucial for preventing by former allies who may attempt to win back valuable supporters through improved offers or personal appeals. Demonstrating immediate benefits and maintaining superior support during transition periods solidifies new relationships against reversal attempts. Reputation is like a building. It takes years to construct, but can be destroyed in moments if you understand its structural weaknesses. However, the most effective reputation destruction happens slowly, through accumulated evidence that gradually shifts public perception until the change appears inevitable rather than orchestrated. I learned this principle by studying the gradual fall of Piero de' Medici, Lorenzo's son, whose reputation deteriorated so systematically that when the French invasion provided the final excuse for his exile, even former supporters felt his removal was necessary. The destruction had been so complete that his departure seemed like natural consequence rather than political maneuvering. The foundation of any reputation rests on consistent patterns that people expect to continue. Lorenzo was trusted because his actions consistently demonstrated competence and judgment over decades. When those patterns begin showing cracks, observers initially excuse individual incidents as anomalies, but as exceptions accumulate, they eventually overwhelm the established perception. Building a case for reputation destruction requires patience and careful documentation. Each piece of evidence must be accurate and verifiable, but the selection and timing of revelations can be strategically managed. The goal is creating an undeniable pattern that forces observers to reevaluate their fundamental assumptions about someone's character or capabilities. I developed techniques for identifying reputation vulnerabilities. By understanding what specific qualities people most valued in different individuals, a leader prized for wisdom becomes vulnerable when their decisions produce poor outcomes. Someone respected for integrity suffers when their private actions contradict public positions. A person admired for strength appears weak when they fail to act decisively during crises. The most effective reputation attacks exploit the gap between public image and private reality that exists for everyone. No person perfectly embodies their reputation, and these discrepancies provide material for systematic undermining when revealed strategically over time rather than all at once. Timing, reputation, revelations requires understanding public attention, cycles and competing narratives. Information released during busy periods gets lost in the noise, while revelations during slow news cycles receive disproportionate attention. The sequence of revelations must build momentum rather than creating isolated incidents that can be explained away individually. I learned to use third parties for reputation destruction to maintain my own credibility and avoid appearing vindictive. When damaging information comes from multiple independent sources, it seems more credible than when traced to a single opponent. Creating networks of information distribution prevents perception that attacks are coordinated. Personal vendettas, the compound effect proves crucial for reputation destruction. Early revelations establish baseline concern that makes subsequent information more credible and significant. Once people begin questioning someone's judgment or character, they interpret ambiguous situations more negatively and remember negative information more clearly than positive counterexamples. Professional reputation destruction often proves more effective than personal character attacks. People can sometimes recover from personal scandals if their professional competence remains unquestioned. But professional incompetence rarely recovers from systematic demonstration. Focusing on capability rather than character often provides more lasting damage. Understanding different audiences allows tailored reputation destruction that speaks to specific concerns and values. What damages someone's reputation with financial partners might actually enhance their standing with religious communities. Effective campaigns identify the audiences that matter most for the target's power and influence. I observed that reputation destruction accelerates when targets begin responding defensively to accumulating criticism. Defensive reactions often appear guilty even when technically accurate, while attempts at explanation can introduce new vulnerabilities or contradictions. The pressure to respond creates opportunities for additional mistakes that compound existing problems. Social proof plays a critical role in reputation shifts. When influential opinion leaders begin expressing doubts, others follow their lead. To avoid appearing naive or out of touch, identifying these key influencers and providing them with compelling reasons to question someone's reputation creates cascading effects throughout broader networks. The permanence of reputation destruction requires ensuring that recovery becomes impossible or extremely difficult. This involves creating lasting consequences that continue generating negative associations even after initial controversies fade. Legal records, financial losses, broken relationships, and professional setbacks all create ongoing reminders that prevent rehabilitation. Modern digital environments have accelerated reputation destruction while making it more permanent. Online information persists indefinitely and can be discovered years later by new audiences who lack context about original circumstances. Understanding these digital dynamics allows strategic use of online platforms for lasting reputation damage. Systematic documentation of the reputation destruction process provides valuable intelligence about what approaches work most effectively against different types of targets. This knowledge improves future operations while creating evidence that can be used to demonstrate your capability to potential allies or opponents, considering whether to challenge you. The psychological impact of reputation destruction often proves more devastating than material losses. Most successful people derive significant identity and self-worth from their public standing, making reputation attacks particularly painful and difficult to compartmentalize. This psychological pressure often leads to poor decision-making that compounds their problems. Creating false rehabilitation opportunities allows continued reputation destruction, disguised as offering chances for redemption. When targets believe they can restore their standing through specific actions, they often make themselves more vulnerable, while demonstrating their continued weakness rather than achieving actual recovery. The most sophisticated approach involves making reputation destruction appear to result from the target's own actions and choices, rather than external attack. This approach prevents sympathy that might lead to rehabilitation while ensuring that observers learn to distrust the target's judgment rather than questioning your motives. The principles I developed in Renaissance Italy have found new life in our digital age, where information travels faster than armies ever could, and reputations can be built or destroyed with unprecedented speed. The fundamentals remain unchanged: understanding human nature, controlling narratives, and applying strategic pressure, but the tools have become more powerful and the battlefield more complex. Today's corporate environments mirror the political courts I navigated in Florence. Office politics, executive maneuvering, and competitive positioning follow the same patterns of alliance building, information warfare, and strategic timing that determines survival in Renaissance city-states. The stakes may seem lower, but the principles operate identically. Social media platforms have become the modern equivalent of the printing press, amplifying messages with exponential reach while creating permanent records of every interaction. Understanding algorithmic amplification allows strategic content distribution that can shape public opinion just as effectively as the pamphlets and rumors I once used to influence Florentine politics. Digital information warfare requires new sophistication about data trails and electronic evidence. Every digital action creates records that can be discovered and analyzed, making operational security more complex than the discreet conversations and handwritten letters of my era. However, the volume of digital information also provides excellent cover for strategic communications disguised as routine interactions. I observe that modern competitive environments have accelerated the pace of strategic maneuvering while shortening attention spans for sustained campaigns. The pressure for immediate results often prevents the patient, long-term approaches that proved most effective in my time. However, those willing to think strategically while others react impulsively gain even greater advantages than in previous eras. Professional networking platforms create unprecedented opportunities for alliance building and intelligence gathering. Understanding how information flows through professional networks allows targeted influence campaigns that can shape career outcomes, business relationships, and industry dynamics through methods that would have taken years to implement in my time. The global nature of modern business creates complexity that mirrors the multi-state politics of Renaissance Italy. Success requires managing relationships across different cultures, legal systems, and political environments, while understanding how actions in one domain affect standings in others. The skills I developed for navigating Italian city-state politics translate directly to modern international business. Digital reputation management has become both more important and more challenging than traditional reputation building. Online information persists indefinitely and can be discovered by audiences worldwide, making reputation destruction potentially more permanent, while also providing tools for systematic reputation rehabilitation through strategic content creation and search engine optimization. Corporate espionage has evolved from physical document theft to sophisticated cyber intelligence gathering that can provide unprecedented insight into competitors' strategies, financial situations, and internal dynamics. Understanding these information capabilities allows both defensive protection and offensive intelligence gathering that surpasses anything available in my era. The speed of modern communication creates opportunities for real-time strategic adaptation. Personal psychology matters enormously in mercy calculations. Proud individuals often find forgiveness more humiliating than punishment, making mercy counterproductive for building future loyalty. Pragmatic people appreciate mercy as intelligent self-interest and may become more reliable allies than those who never opposed you. Understanding these psychological differences allows appropriate matching of response to personality The public perception of mercy affects its strategic value significantly. Mercy that appears calculated and strategic may actually reduce respect for your judgment, while mercy that seems genuinely principled can enhance your reputation for fairness and wisdom. Managing these perceptions requires careful consideration of how different audiences will interpret your decisions. I observed that partial destruction often proves more dangerous than complete elimination or complete forgiveness. Leaving enemies wounded but not dead creates ongoing threats from people who understand your capabilities but retain motivation for revenge. This middle ground combines the disadvantages of both approaches while providing the benefits of neither. Economic and social factors influence mercy decisions beyond personal considerations. Completely destroying wealthy or well-connected opponents may generate broader resistance from others who fear similar treatment. Conversely, showing mercy to dangerous enemies may encourage challenges from those who conclude that opposition carries acceptable risks. The resources required for continued suppression must be weighed against the benefits of elimination or conversion. Some enemies require constant monitoring and occasional pressure to prevent resurgence, draining attention and resources that could be invested in new opportunities. Others can be safely ignored once their power base has been dismantled. Family and relationship dynamics create additional complexity for mercy decisions. Destroying someone completely may create lasting enmity among their relatives and descendants, while showing mercy may generate gratitude that extends beyond the individual involved. Understanding these extended consequences prevents short-term tactical victories from creating long-term strategic problems. The technological environment affects mercy calculations in modern contexts. Digital records and global communication mean that mercy or ruthlessness towards specific individuals can quickly become known worldwide, affecting reputation and relationships far beyond immediate circumstances. This visibility requires more careful consideration of precedents and long-term implications. I learned that the appearance of mercy can sometimes provide cover for ensuring that enemies remain permanently neutralized through indirect means. Public forgiveness, combined with private arrangements that prevent future threats, allows you to maintain a reputation for magnanimity while achieving practical security. Legal and regulatory frameworks in modern environments often constrain both mercy and elimination options, requiring more sophisticated approaches that work within established systems. Understanding these constraints allows strategic planning that achieves practical objectives, while maintaining legal compliance and social acceptability. The most sophisticated practitioners develop reputations for predictable mercy criteria that allow opponents to understand the consequences of different choices. When enemies know that certain behaviors will result in destruction while others lead to rehabilitation, they may choose restraint that serves your interests better than any punishment could achieve. Mercy toward some enemies often serves as psychological warfare against others who observe that cooperation leads to better treatment than continued resistance. This demonstration effect can reduce future opposition while building your reputation for fairness and strategic thinking. The ultimate test of mercy decisions lies in their long-term consequences for your position and objectives. Mercy that strengthens your overall strategic situation demonstrates wisdom, while mercy that creates ongoing problems reveals poor judgment. Developing this discrimination requires experience, careful observation, and honest assessment of outcomes. Understanding how to destroy enemies inevitably means understanding how enemies might destroy you. My years developing these strategies taught me that knowledge of offensive techniques creates both power and vulnerability. Power to overcome opponents, but vulnerability to those who understand the same methods. True mastery requires building defenses as sophisticated as your attacks. The greatest danger comes from those who have studied your methods and learned to turn them against you. During my diplomatic career, I occasionally encountered opponents who had clearly observed my techniques and developed countermeasures that neutralized my usual approaches. These experiences taught me that strategic innovation must be continuous to stay ahead of those who learn from your successes. Building genuine loyalty provides the strongest defense against alliance disruption tactics. Most alliance conversion succeeds because relationships are based on convenience rather than authentic mutual benefit. When you consistently deliver superior value to your allies while treating them with genuine respect and consideration, their loyalty becomes much more difficult to purchase or manipulate. Information security becomes crucial when operating in environments where others use intelligence gathering against you. I learned to compartmentalize sensitive information, limiting access based on genuine need rather than rank or relationship. Even trusted associates should only know details directly relevant to their specific responsibilities. Preventing single points of failure that could expose entire operations. Creating multiple independent power sources protects against economic warfare and social isolation tactics. Dependence on single revenue streams, relationships, or reputation sources creates vulnerabilities that sophisticated opponents can exploit systematically. Diversification across different domains makes coordinated attacks much more difficult to execute effectively. I developed techniques for detecting early signs of coordinated campaigns against my position. Unusual patterns in how information flows, coincidental timing of problems across different areas, and subtle changes in ally behavior often indicate systematic pressure rather than random difficulties. Early detection allows defensive action before campaigns reach critical momentum. Reputation management requires proactive rather than reactive approaches. Building strong positive narratives before attacks begin provides defensive foundation that makes negative information less credible and impactful. People who have clear positive impressions resist contradictory information more strongly than those with neutral or uncertain opinions. Understanding your own psychological vulnerabilities allows defensive preparation against manipulation attempts. Everyone has pressure points related to fears, desires, and insecurities that can be exploited by skilled opponents. Honest self-assessment and emotional discipline reduce susceptibility to psychological warfare, while improving under pressure. Counterintelligence operations provide both defensive protection and offensive opportunities. Monitoring who seeks information about your activities, tracking how intelligence flows between different parties, and occasionally providing false information can reveal enemy networks while protecting genuine secrets from discovery. Legal and regulatory compliance create defensive shields in modern environments where rule-based attacks have become common. Maintaining impeccable compliance with all relevant regulations eliminates easy attack vectors while forcing opponents to use more sophisticated and risky approaches that may expose their activities. Network redundancy protects against social isolation campaigns by ensuring that loss of specific relationships doesn't create critical vulnerabilities. Maintaining connections across different social and professional circles prevents opponents from achieving decisive isolation through targeted relationship disruption. I learned to recognize when my own success patterns were becoming predictable and therefore exploitable. Regular variation in approaches, timing, and methods prevents opponents from developing effective countermeasures, while maintaining strategic flexibility for adapting to changing circumstances. Financial independence and resource diversification provide protection against economic warfare tactics. Multiple income sources, liquid reserves, and minimal fixed obligations create resilience against financial pressure campaigns, while preserving options during crisis periods. Creating uncertainty about your defensive capabilities can deter attacks without revealing specific countermeasures. When potential opponents cannot predict how you might respond to different approaches, they become more cautious about initiating campaigns that might backfire or expose their own vulnerabilities. Monitoring feedback loops helps identify when your actions are creating unintended consequences that might be exploited by opponents. Sometimes defensive measures create new vulnerabilities or signal concerns that hadn't been obvious to potential attackers. Regular assessment prevents defensive preparations from becoming offensive liabilities. Building relationships with neutral third parties provides early warning systems and potential mediation resources when conflicts begin developing. These relationships can provide intelligence about emerging threats while offering saving resolution opportunities that prevent conflicts from escalating beyond manageable levels. Understanding the broader competitive environment allows strategic positioning that minimizes exposure to attack while maximizing advantages. Sometimes the best defense involves choosing battles carefully rather than trying to defend every position equally against all potential threats. The most sophisticated defense involves making attacks against you more costly and risky for opponents than tolerating your success. When potential enemies understand that challenging you will likely result in their own destruction regardless of outcomes, they become much more inclined toward accommodation and cooperation. Personal discipline and emotional control provide foundational protection against most manipulation attempts. When you maintain clear judgment, regardless of external pressure, and resist impulses toward reactive behavior, sophisticated psychological campaigns lose much of their effectiveness while revealing opponents' intentions. Recovery planning ensures that temporary setbacks don't become permanent defeats. Understanding how to rebuild from various types of damage allows strategic risk-taking while maintaining confidence that survival and eventual recovery remain possible even if specific campaigns fail. The ultimate protection lies in developing genuine competence and value that makes your destruction costly for the broader environment. When your success benefits many people and your failure would damage their interests, you gain natural allies who will resist attacks against you for their own protection rather than personal loyalty. As I reflect on these strategies from the vantage point of my years and the wisdom they have brought, I am struck by a profound truth. The greatest victory is not the destruction of your enemies, but the creation of a world where such destruction becomes unnecessary. The master strategist ultimately transcends the need for strategy through the establishment of systems that serve everyone's interests. My younger self, driven by the urgency of survival in Renaissance politics, focused intensely on tactical supremacy and immediate advantage. Age has taught me that lasting influence comes not from perfecting the arts of conflict, but from creating conditions where conflict serves constructive rather than destructive purposes. The highest application of strategic knowledge involves building rather than destroying. The techniques I have shared carry tremendous power and therefore tremendous responsibility. They can elevate capable individuals while protecting them from those who would use similar methods for purely selfish ends. However, they can also corrupt those who become intoxicated by their effectiveness and lose sight of larger purposes. Beyond personal advancement, I have observed that those who mastered these arts fall into two categories: those who use them to create lasting value that benefits themselves and others, and those who become addicted to the process of strategic manipulation for its own sake. The first group builds legacies that enhance human flourishing, while the second ultimately destroys both others and themselves through endless cycles of conflict. The true test of strategic mastery lies not in your ability to defeat opponents, but in your capacity to convert opponents into allies, competitors into collaborators, and conflicts into opportunities for mutual advancement. This transformation requires the same psychological insight and tactical skill as destruction, but applies them toward constructive rather than purely competitive ends. Understanding human nature deeply enough to manipulate it effectively also provides the knowledge necessary to inspire, motivate, and guide people toward their highest potential. The same insights that reveal vulnerabilities also illuminate strengths that can be developed and channeled productively. This positive application often proves more personally satisfying than victory through domination. I have learned that reputation for strategic capability can be more valuable than the actual exercise of that capability. When others understand that you possess the knowledge and skills to defend yourself effectively, they become much more inclined toward cooperation and less tempted by aggressive approaches. This deterrent effect allows relationships to develop based on mutual respect rather than fear or submission. The accumulation of strategic knowledge creates compound advantages that extend far beyond individual conflicts. Understanding, negotiation, psychology, timing, and influence enhances every aspect of personal and professional life, while providing security that comes from genuine capability rather than external protection. Modern environments offer unprecedented opportunities for applying these principles constructively through entrepreneurship, leadership, and social innovation. The same skills that once determined survival in Renaissance politics can now create businesses, build organizations, and solve social problems that improve conditions for millions of people. The digital age has democratized access to strategic knowledge while amplifying the potential impact of its application. Small groups of strategically sophisticated individuals can now influence outcomes that previously required vast resources and formal authority. This democratization increases both opportunities and responsibilities for those who develop these capabilities. I encourage you to approach this knowledge with humility and purpose beyond personal advancement. The most successful strategic thinkers I have observed throughout history were those who understood that true power comes from enabling others' success rather than preventing it. Their legacies endure because they created value that outlasted their individual lifespans. The principles I have shared are tools that can be used for any purpose their wielder chooses. Like fire, they can provide warmth and light, or cause destruction and suffering, depending on how they are applied. The choice of application reveals more about the user's character than about the nature of the tools themselves. As you develop your own strategic capabilities, remember that every victory creates precedents and expectations that will shape future challenges. Short-term tactical successes that rely on deception or exploitation often create long-term strategic problems that require increasingly sophisticated solutions. Building reputation for fairness and reliability, even while maintaining competitive advantage, creates sustainable foundations for lasting success. The greatest strategic minds throughout history have been those who transcended the immediate competitive environment to create new frameworks that redefined the rules of engagement entirely. Rather than becoming masters of existing games, they invented better games that served everyone's interests more effectively. My legacy is not the specific techniques I developed, but the demonstration that strategic thinking can overcome any disadvantage and that intelligence applied consistently creates opportunities that reshape entire environments. I encourage you to use this knowledge not merely to prevail over others, but to create conditions where everyone's talents can flourish while you achieve your own worthy objectives. The true measure of strategic mastery lies in the quality of the world you create through your actions. Use these tools wisely, and they will serve not only your immediate interests, but the broader human project of building societies where conflict becomes collaboration and competition drives innovation that benefits all participants.